Já, þá tekur til máls Mary C. Beaudry, prófessor sögulegri fornleifafræði og mannfræði matarmenningar við Boston University. Mary Beaudry einn þekktasti og virtasti fornleifafræðingur Bandaríkjanna á sviði sögulegrar fornleifafræði og iðnaðar fornleifafræði, en rannsóknir hennar hafa þó kannski mest snúist að heimilismenningu síðustu alda í ljósi síðnýlendufræða og kynjafræða. Og síðar árum hefur hún snúið sér í frekari mæli að rannsóknum á matarmenningu og mannfræði matarmenningar, en árið 2010 tók hún að sér, vel að merkja til hliðar við stöðu sína sem prófessor í sögulegri fornleifafræði, stöðu prófessors í matargerðarlist eða matarmenningu við Metropolitan College við Boston Háskóla. Fyrirlesturinn sem Mary Beaudry mun flytja hér nefnist It's a Woman Thing, Women's Body-Worn Implements and the Construction of Feminine Identity in Early America, en hér mun hún ræða samband kvenna og hluta og einkum hluta sem tengdust handavinnu og útsöfum og hvernig þessir hlutir tóku þátt í að móta vitund kvenna í Ameríku á síðari tímum og hvernig þeir geta hjálpað okkur í að skilja kvenlegt sjálf, persónugerfi og ævisögur á þessum tíma. Og líkt og hér áðan þá mun okkur gefast smá tími í lokin til að spurja hana út úr. Professor Mary Beaudry, it's an honor for us to have you participating in our project, my favorite things, and I would like to invite you here to the podium and give your lecture. Thank you.
I like the iconography on this. That's forward, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Cheers. As you can see, I changed my mind again. I changed my title for this talk. But first I wanted to say that Eva is a hard act to follow, and I don't think you're going to get quite the intellectual breadth and depth out of me that we get from her. But I wanted to talk initially about probate inventories, and then I changed my mind because I realized that the taxonomies that you can get out of the object listings and probate inventories are those of the inventory takers and not of the users. And I thought that wasn't really as appropriate for my favorite things project as perhaps to talk about body-worn types of implements that women have used over time. And I happened to run across very recently a piece by Dan Carlson on Viking knives, especially he works in Gotland in Sweden, and he has posted on his ResearchGate piece, a really nice little synthetic thing about the finds chiefly in Gotland, but I found some interesting ideas about that. So. But first I thought I would take a few moments to just say some of the ideas that are behind all of this. And because I think that looking at objects, in order to interpret them properly, you really have to think about the people that used them or wore them or made them and so on. And also how they were used in relationship to the body. And so embodiment becomes an important issue, especially in body-worn objects. And also the whole world of things and how things relate to one another. And I don't know if we'll get that far along. And so the premise is that people do construct identities for themselves as individuals, as well as being a unique person, but also as members of groups, and some of which are voluntary and some are not. And groups can extend to age brackets and other statuses in life and so on. So also I think that as everyone who's read Judith Butler and many others has come to realize that identity can be inscribed on the body or through the body, through clothing, personal adornment, posture, gesture, all those things that have to do with the preservation of self, the construction of self, and the way that people carry themselves in everyday life. So I'm also very intrigued by the phenomenon across history and so on, as the way that the things that are regularly associated with people's bodies, and in my case I'm interested in women's work and so on, has special significance for the individual as part of their identity construction. And so that we also, they tend to create a situation in which objects come to stand for or symbolize aspects of personal and or group identity, which is both imposed perhaps by stereotypes and the like, but also something that people often, individuals, embrace and take advantage of in the way that they consume goods and, of course, present the person. Now, many people have written about women's work over time. Women's work is very ancient, and of course, because Elizabeth Wayland Barber's book, Women's Work, the First 30,000 Years, gives you some idea. But one of the main things that women are often associated with is textile work. So that the drop spindle is sort of a trope of women's work, textile work, especially throughout much of the past and up until relatively recent times, with the spindle whorls being very critical in terms of identifying the presence of women's work. But of course, this isn't a worn object, but I think that it's because the spindle whorls have become fairly synonymous with women's work, as I think I've said. But in Dan Carlson's piece on knives, he talks about the fact that he did a survey of the 600 and so knives found in Gotland and the adjacent regions that were part of the Baltic trade and so on. And he said that the majority of the knives are found in women's graves. They're seldom found in use contexts and others unless they're just a little fragmentary. But because women and men were both buried with knives, but they're much more common in women's graves, that they are somewhat emblematic of women. And what is intriguing here is, so it's really earlier than early America, even though we know that Norse peoples were in America about 1000 AD, is the presence in the graves of knives that you can see the one on your left, that is a sheathed knife that is just placed in the grave. But in the case of this grave 7, female grave here, you can see that she has a waist-hung appendage, or what is Dan Carlson refers to as an equipment brooch, something that fastens to the body that then dangles perhaps not just a knife, but other kinds of things that the woman would have used. And so she's also got the things that indicate the typical kind of Viking age women's clothing. And so this equipment brooch with the bronze chain is, to me, like a precursor to the chatelaine, the waist-worn appendages that many women wore from, at least the Viking Age and medieval times more broadly, and right up through the 19th century, and even into the 20th century if you watch Downton Abbey. And I'll bring that up to date in a minute. One of the things that intrigues me, so here is one of these waist-hung appendages from another grave, and I've forgotten where it is, but it is a Viking Age grave, with a pin case, with a pin and or needle case. Another thing that is often depicted, at least in the reenactors realm, is women having the bowsprung shears suspended from their waist. And so that's what you see in a lot of the reenactors things. The reenactors, Viking Age reenactors, is a huge phenomenon recently, and growing bigger all the time. And there's a really interesting article by a couple of ethnographers about the deep meanings of neo-paganism and Viking reenactments. And that's a whole other topic that's worth pursuing in some other context, I think. But it occurs to me that one thing that the reenactors do is they re-experience the very physical embodiment of wearing these implements. And one would assume that a pair of these shears or the like would be quite weighty compared to many things. And I should say too that the women tended to not wear their knives on their belts the way men did. So there's another distinction there. So that it seems to me that a belt would bring less drag, less weight. It would weigh, the knife would still weigh, but you'd feel it differently when it's sort of swinging from something attached to a strap around your waist or the like, as opposed to on a leather belt. There's, throughout all the centuries, women's needlework activities, women's sewing, became sort of synonymous with certain types of expected feminine behavior and character. And I find that many, this photograph of women who've been working in the herring sheds in Scotland, keeping out their knitting while they're walking home, the herring lasses, as they would be called, is one example of the idea that women keeping their hands busy shows a sign of industriousness and good character. And the same with this portrait of a woman depicted at her sewing in what presumably is late 17th, early 18th century context, with the dog, which is the typical symbol of loyalty and devotion. So devotion to women's activities. And also many writers, even critics at the time, talking about women's needlework in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century, was that it also put them in a position of having downcast eyes, that when they looked up that it was almost coquettish and flirtatious, and ultimately very feminine. So this brings me to the chatelaine. There's lots of different kinds of chatelaines. The name comes, of course, by the woman having the keys to the stores, the wine cellar or anything else in a large household. But chatelaines became something that were worn by many people, including a rage for them in the 19th century as just really outlandish ornaments. But this 17th century one is essentially a sewing chatelaine with the scissors and a needle case with a thimble case at its top and a pin poppet or pin cushion. So it does depict the woman is a mistress of the household, but this one doesn't contain keys. It just contains the things that she would need for her everyday work, as well as probably some fine embroidery. And it's just incidental that the initials inscribed out on are MB, but it does make it rather attractive to me. So chatelaines become overemphasized, and here actually this one is, I don't know. The one on your left is Viking Age. And then you have a 19th century example, which is a bad photograph of a reenactor. And then you can see on Mrs. Hughes, if you ever watch Downton Abbey, I'm a huge Downton Abbey fan, but I'm not going to the movie. I don't go to movie theaters because they play everything too loud. You can see she's wearing her chatelaine, with the keys to the various things that she has the domain over in the household, and which would probably be the linen stores and other things like that. And then, of course, other characters you might recognize from the program. But as I said, these become something very major. In North America, very few have been excavated at colonial sites, and I do just one or two, and but that's probably because they got handed down by women in their wills and from mother to daughter and so on, and then that's probably why you find so many in antique stores or in collections and in museums, that they were preserved and didn't end up in the ground. This image is one that shows a woman with her tatting shuttle. So she's not wearing this, but she does have a little bag that has her, that's suspended from her arm, not her belt, but it's got the whatever, the silk or whatever she's tatting away with. But it's part of a series that talks about the character of an individual, and there's some that apply to men too, and how they should be behaving. But it's, if you keep yourself within compass, meaning doing the kinds of feminine work or duties that you would have, you will be something of a crown to her husband. Otherwise, the little vignettes on the side show that if you somehow fail to be working at your needlework persistently, you will probably become a drunkard, drop your baby on its head, be taken away into prostitution by men who will take advantage of you, and other horrible things that could happen to you. So beware and keep within compass. So these kinds of things were very much distributed, especially in the 18th century. And this parallels the tendency for women who have their portraits painted. And in this case, this is the Countess of Albemarle, painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds. So we're looking at the highest of the high in terms of social rank, choosing to be depicted with their needlework. One thing that always intrigues me is how frequently the scissors are symbolically placed in the image too. But you can see she's got a tatting shuttle. She's got rich and luxurious fabrics, silks, and so on, and lace in her costume. But she's also displayed in such a way with her hands looking very graceful and feminine. Despite the fact that she is a mature woman, she's showing herself to be following the right path, but also perhaps presenting a highly feminized sense of her identity because of this. And of course, tatting is a bit of more of a fancy work than you would think of as everyday duties. And this gal is one of my favorites. This painting was done in New England in about 1835. It's Alethea Fiske-Farrar, who is shown here in the portrait she had painted of herself in a very sort of buffly kind of a dress with a tightly cinched waist, with a fancy belt buckle, and then the waist-hung appendage that contains her very nice pair of sewing scissors, probably made in Sheffield, England. But you can see that she's shown at her work, and that's a way that she's presenting herself as having the right kind of character and industriousness that should go along with the being a good wife, mother, etc. Although none of the rest of the family appears in the picture, but this is a very common thing that women were regularly depicted this way. I've written a lot about bodkins because they fascinate me so much. And these are mostly 17th century European bodkins. Bodkins are classified in needlework terms as needles, but that's not all they did. They were for threading and lacing corsets, or dunning in drawstrings when you had a drawstring, kind of a skirt or shift or pair of trousers and the like, in which case you'd probably have something not quite so deluxe. But because all women wore bodices and would need, especially if they were nursing mothers, to loosen their corsets and their bodices and their corsets on a regular basis, just about every woman had one, whether they would have ones for young women too before marriage. And very typically, they are inscribed with the initials or the name of the woman who owned and used it. And this makes them really fascinating objects. For one thing, one can write one can rediscover the lives of certain women by finding these objects and tracing down their histories once you've known their name. It's tougher with initials only, obviously. So the other thing is that they were worn on the body. I did that, but that's backwards. That's the close-up, and that shows a woman with a bodkin that you can barely see sticking out of her coif. And here's one that I've never been able to get a good history of. It's recovered from what used to be the mill pond in Boston, and it does have initials on it, E.I., which could be Elizabeth Johnson or something. It looks like an I, but it's probably a J. But we don't have any record of women living at this property where it was excavated, because it was the home for the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel in New England among the Indians. So in the 17th century, which is when this dates to. But it's one thing I thought maybe I could pursue in my retirement, and looking at more of these objects from colonial Boston. But this one being broken was discarded and not passed on. But I'm still struggling with the idea that did people pass these on when they had their names on them? And would they pass them on to a daughter or the like? And it's unclear. Oh, that's a lovely shot. There she. But the main purpose of the bodkin here is you can see this is by Hooch, a painting showing a woman lacing up her bodkin, and you can maybe just see lacing up her corset. You can see the bodkin in her hand when you have a clear image, at least, and dreamily looking at her baby, who's now sated and off to sleep again, I suspect. But this would have been one thing that involved regular interaction with this object. And when I went to study bodkins in collections in Maryland and elsewhere, I suddenly realized the property of such a thing has a lot to do with the sensory aspects of this cold metal, that when you touch it, it becomes warm, it's shiny, it's reflective, and many, as I said, many of them are inscribed with names. Some of them are not they're of copper alloy, but tinned to look like silver, if well-to-do women had silver ones. But women who weren't so well-to-do, who showed up with a silver bodkin, might be taken into court because it was against the sumptuary laws for people of certain income levels to wear certain kinds of clothes, to have silver bodkins, silver needles, silver thimbles, or lace scarves and the like. So people who acquired these things were creating identities that were beyond those that were seen as their station in life, and that fascinates me as well. So that usually women would wear the bodkin up under their coif, but they also sometimes would just tie it to the thing so that it would be suspended from the bodice. So that was all I had. What I'm trying to do with this sort of study is to figure out how women constructed identity, as I said, presented themselves, and also had what I can see from looking at the wear on the objects and so on, the kinds of relationships that they had with these objects. And I know that it's no news that people construct and present themselves through the way that they adorn themselves, model and shape their body through relentless exercise programs and the like. But in the case of getting at the lives of women in the past, I think that these objects give us a really excellent window into reconstructing the objects' everyday use and the way that there were the sensory interaction with them. And I think that My recent work has all been on food, so I am dredging back into the past on this, but it's still a topic I want to go back to and bring to it some of the ideas about the archaeology of the senses that I've been working with in my work on the archaeology of meals and mealtimes, which I'm calling gastronomical archaeology. And so once I finish that project, I hope to get back to things like bodkins and the like. Thank you.